Eleanor placed the pie on the lawyer's desk, her face calm as stone. Brent Redding's smugness faded fast when he unfolded the paper hidden beneath the crust. His hands shook, his voice caught. She met his eyes and said just one word: final. In that moment, everything changed. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The afternoon sun leaned low when they said their vows, and the shadows of the cottonwood leaves danced faintly across Eleanor's weathered hands, clasped in Jesse's. Her ring, a wide gold band from another life, reflected a dull glint of light, worn smooth from decades of work and silence. Jesse's fingers, rough as saddle leather, closed over hers with surprising care. There was no kiss, only the preacher's solemn nod, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, and the sound of someone clearing their throat far off, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps to mark the strangeness of the moment. People had not come, not her neighbors, nor his old ranch hands, nor the churchwomen who once brought pies when her husband passed. Even the postman who once lingered for coffee now hurried his route. In town, their union had become a kind of entertainment. A hushed curiosity passed between shelves at the general store, between sips of weak diner coffee. The age difference alone was enough to cause stir, but the fact that it was Eleanor, stoic, sharp-tongued Eleanor Whitlock, only deepened the gossip. She had ruled her ranch alone for over 2 decades. She didn't need a man. And Jesse? He barely scraped by, working other people's cattle, sleeping in barns more often than under roofs. But none of that mattered beneath the cottonwood. There, it was just 2 people and a thin slice of shared courage. At the house, her house, things moved slowly. Jesse didn't touch the master bedroom. He slept in the sun porch, on a cot he built himself from scrap pine and old canvas. At dawn, he was already at work, oiling hinges that had long since accepted their squeak, hauling wood even though the hired boy still came Tuesdays. Eleanor didn't comment. She only noticed the quiet competence in his movements, the way he took up space without demanding it. She had long learned that silence held more truth than most speeches. In the evenings, she read aloud. Steinbeck, mostly, sometimes Frost, her voice catching on the same passages each time, like a needle brushing over a scar. Jesse never interrupted, just sat across from her with a cup of chicory, eyes half-lidded, hands idle but present. One night, reaching for her shawl, he opened the wrong drawer, found a bundle of fabric with the scent of cedar and thyme, and within it a folded letter. He did not read it. Not then. He simply held it, his thumb brushing over the fragile crease as if sensing the weight inside. Something shifted in that silence. A beginning, barely spoken. The letter crackled when Jesse unfolded it, the brittle paper resisting as though it remembered too much. He read it once, then twice, each time slower, eyes tracing the curve of every faded letter as if trying to hear the voice behind them. My dearest Eleanor. The words were soft, almost tender, but what followed landed like hooves in dry dust. The year was 1942. James Whitlock had written this before shipping off in uniform, before telegrams ever reached this porch with the words, "Missing in action." He hadn't meant for her to read it unless he didn't return, and though he eventually had, in body if not in soul, this letter had remained buried, like the truth he feared wouldn't survive him. Jesse sat long into the night, the hearth casting uneasy shadows that licked the corners of the room like suspicion itself. Eleanor had long since gone to bed, or pretended to. He didn't disturb her. The flames hissed, the logs shifted, and still he stared at the line. It's not gold, Ellie, but something worth more. Truth. That word, truth, sat heavy on his chest, heavier than any saddlebag he'd ever hauled. Jesse had known many kinds of silence in his life, men too proud to speak, women too wounded. But this one? This one was centuries deep. By morning, the world outside was all frost and hush. The coffee boiled over once before he noticed, and when he knocked lightly on Eleanor's door, she didn't look surprised, only tired. He held the letter between thumb and forefinger like it might bite. She didn't ask how he found it, didn't scold him for reading it. Her eyes went to the fire instead, like always. "He never came back," she said, and her voice lacked tremor. "Not really. He was different after the war. Distant. He told me he had secrets, but I didn't push. One day he left the house for an hour and came back covered in dirt. Said he'd been fixing the fence. I think now, that's when he buried it." Jesse's voice was quiet. "Why not dig it up after he passed?" "I buried hope with him," she whispered. The wind outside pressed against the house like breath on glass. They moved without further talk, crossing the brittle grass behind the barn, stepping past the old rose bush that had grown into a clawed, defiant thing. Eleanor pointed to a patch where the ground sagged slightly. Jesse knelt and dug with his bare hands, the soil cold and unyielding until his fingers struck wood. The chest was small and plain, its hinges rusted but intact. He unwrapped it slowly, like revealing a wound. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of earth and memory, lay a cracked leather journal and a deed. Jesse turned the paper over. His jaw tightened. Not Eleanor's name. Samuel R. Whitlock. A silence fell between them, but it was no longer the kind that protected. Eleanor touched the edge of the chest. "I never knew." And in that moment, Jesse saw the shape of a danger not just buried, but watching, alive, moving, closer than either of them had dared believe. The lawyer arrived in a car too new for these parts, its chrome grin flashing beneath the high sun like it knew it didn't belong. Dust curled around its tires in lazy spirals as it rolled to a stop in front of the Whitlock house, where the porch sagged with age but not surrender. Eleanor stood at the railing, arms crossed beneath her shawl. She hadn't called for him, hadn't written or sent word. Yet here he was, Brent Redding, in a navy suit that shimmered like oil and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Jesse stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped mid-stride when he recognized him. Brent had been around years ago, just long enough to be remembered. The kind of man who asked too many questions and listened too closely. Folks used to whisper that he was James Whitlock's business associate. But Jesse had seen the familiarity in the way he leaned on the old man's gait, the ease with which he'd slipped into Eleanor's kitchen uninvited. Now he walked in like he owned the place. "I represent the heir," Brent said smoothly, dropping a folded document onto Eleanor's kitchen table with all the gentleness of a falling axe. The deed bore Samuel R. Whitlock's name in crisp print, the ink fresh, the message unmistakable. Eleanor didn't reach for it, didn't blink. She simply looked up and asked, "Is this a threat, Mr. Redding?" He smiled wider. "It's just business, Mrs. Whitlock. You know how inheritance works. Blood always finds its way." Later, outside by the porch rail, he turned to Jesse. "You married her for money," he said. "But now you're just in the way." Jesse didn't reply. His jaw tensed, his fists clenched. One heartbeat more and he might have shattered the man's teeth. But instead, he stepped back, because this wasn't about pride. It was about something far older and heavier than any insult. That night, Eleanor stared at the fire like it might offer answers if she watched long enough. "Maybe it's time to let go," she said, and her voice was brittle as frost. Jesse sat beside her, silent a moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he said. "It's time to fight back." And before the sun rose, he was gone, horse-saddled, coat dusted with dawn, eyes set hard. The notary, The archives, the old widow of Sheriff Bailey, once just a quiet fixture in the back pews, now the keeper of forgotten truths. Jesse moved through town like a man unearthing ghosts. And then he found it. Misfiled, yellowed with time. A page from James Whitlock's will, long buried beneath clerical dust and bureaucratic oversight. It bore James's signature, jagged and firm. It named Eleanor as sole executor and permanent steward of the Whitlock estate. No mention of Samuel, no loopholes. It was the paper Brent hadn't expected, because he had never bothered to look beyond the deed. Jesse rode back slow, wind howling around him like an old hymn. The document tucked inside his coat felt heavier than a rifle. It was law, but it was also something else. Proof. But when he handed it to Eleanor, when her fingers touched the parchment, something changed. Not in the paper, but in her. Her back straightened. Her breath steadied. She didn't weep. She stood. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and defiance. Eleanor moved with quiet precision, her apron dusted in flour, sleeves rolled to her elbows like she was back in the thick of branding season. She didn't bake for company anymore, not since the town turned polite and distant after James died. But this pie, this wasn't for comfort. It was for clarity, for closure. The crust was golden and firm, the filling heavy with tart apples from the orchard she still pruned herself. And beneath the folded wax paper lining the basket, wrapped in cotton cloth and steadied with twine, was the missing page Jesse had unearthed. James Whitlock's true will, handwritten, signed, and sealed in the dusty corner of a forgotten file cabinet. When she arrived at the lawyer's office, the pie was warm. Brent Redding answered with that same blade-thin smirk, already halfway into a performance. His jacket hung on the back of a leather chair, and his sleeves were rolled as if he meant to dig into paperwork or ruin a woman's legacy. But Eleanor didn't flinch. "I brought something for you," she said, extending the basket. He took it, chuckling. "Is this a peace offering?" "No," she said, steady. "It's a correction." His smile faltered as he peeled back the cloth and saw the paper tucked beneath the pie tin. He lifted it with 2 fingers like it might bite. As his eyes scanned the faded ink, the color drained from his face in increments. "This," he began, fingers twitching, voice clipped. "Is final," she said, her tone as plain and firm as weathered oak. Brent opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The air shifted, quiet and dense. The office no longer belonged to him. The next day, his car was gone. No goodbyes, no statements, just the wind returning to its rightful silence. Back at the ranch, Jesse mended the porch swing she hadn't used in years. Eleanor brought him a slice of the same pie, cooled now, softened at the edges. He didn't say much. He never did. But that night, he rubbed linseed oil into her rocking chair, the one James never liked. And she, in turn, stitched his name in blue thread along the hem of a new quilt. Her quiet signature, her way of saying, "You belong." They shared more silences than words, but they meant more. On Sundays, they'd sit side by side watching the sun fall behind the ridge, saying nothing. Because nothing needed saying. Weeks passed, slow and full. One day, Jesse found her journal. Tucked between books of poetry and fence ledgers, its pages held verses in Eleanor's neat, slanted hand, some brittle with grief, some aching with longing, some shining with stubborn grace. He sat with it for an hour, then wept. "I never married you for money," he told her later, voice hoarse from dust and something deeper. Eleanor only smiled. "I know, but I made sure you'd stay anyway." They planted a tree above the spot where truth had once been buried. In spring, it bloomed in quiet defiance. Just like them.